but it's kind of related to like genus, maybe in the animal kingdom or something like that. It's just like a certain type of person. So gender originally meant um like it was your description of yourself, whether it wasn't just correlated with sex, but like your weight, how you looked, your height, and everything like that. And then there was a period in history, and the word gender is only a few hundred years old, as far as 500 maybe at the most. There was a period in time, maybe Victorian period, when saying the word sex, they found it kind of offensive, the actual word sex, and we kind of still do today because we correlate it with the act of sex. So people started using the word gender instead of saying sex. They started saying gender because the word sex became offensive, and so that's when sex and gender now became this term for sex. And for maybe the last couple hundred years or so, people have been conflating the two terms. And I don't really have a problem with that, but it's all kind of built on context. But I think like officially, like the state should use the word sex to refer to male and female, and that should be your biological identity. And that gender has a different identity and a different role in society and culture, and that we can develop a kind of sophisticated view of gender that isn't just exactly the same as sex, because I don't think anybody actually talks that way, because they use certain terms, gendered terms, that are separate from biology, if that makes sense. And we can get into the details.
So, you mentioned that gender has different roles within society than sex does. Um,
Yeah.
what's an example of that? Like, I can't really think of a situation where you would be required to talk about gender instead of
So
sex.
gender is mainly, is at least we now in modern day terms, gender refers to masculine and feminine, not male and female. And so we use gender
And
to
then they're kind
describe
of
masculine and
derivatives
feminine
from
things.
male and female.
Yes, it is correlated with it, and it is related, but we gender things that are not biological. So in the most abstract sense of the word, um, gender, the sun and the moon are gendered typically, and it varies among cultures, but the sun and the moon are gendered as male and female. And and so I think you would intuitively know that the sun is typically gendered as male or masculine, and the moon is gendered as feminine. But there are cultures that do switch it, or at least the moon is kind of masculine, and that is kind of like the most abstract sense. But um, we gender names. Names are gendered male and female. Languages are gendered male and female, different words. And the gender ideology attacks that stuff, and they try to get rid of it. But I find that if you don't have a sophisticated concept of what gender means and what you're talking about, you're kind of losing the richness in society. And to me, a conservative should bear this in mind, that like if you're just thinking of gender as just biological sex, you're losing a lot of tradition, you're losing a lot of your culture and the way you speak about things and the way you look at the world and our roles as humans in society. Because what does it mean to be a man? It just doesn't mean your genitals, like that your chromosomes. Your chromosomes, people didn't even know what chromosomes were up until the late 1800s. So that shouldn't even be coming to the discussion about what gender is. But being a man and being a woman are very sophisticated things that you don't find in the animal kingdom. Even animals have sex, but animals don't have gender in the same way that humans do. So to me, that just points to that gender should be a separate subject, because there aren't men we don't see men in the animal kingdom in the same way we do as humans, if that makes sense.
I mean, we do. Almost nearly every animal species have clearly different sexes, and you know they each have their role within that sex. And I find it interesting. You said that people didn't even know what chromosomes were until the 1800s or so. Therefore, sex and gender should be different. I mean, obviously they didn't have the technology to research and discover the inner workings of the human body, so they're not going to know about chromosomes. But they had clear knowledge of what those chromosomes represent or create. So, for example, a male with XY chromosomes, people in the 1800s are not going to know that they have XY chromosomes, but they're going to know that that person's a male or a man because of their physical attributes. So just because they didn't have the technology to know what chromosomes were, I'm not sure that's really a good defense for the separation of gender and sex as the words. And you also said before that people were offended by the word sex, and that the word gender was used as a replacement. So doesn't that kind of mean that they're interchangeable and the same thing?
Yeah, I have no problem with like it. They're just naturally we use the words interchangeably, and we understand like anybody who speaks a language to know the context because language is kind of very complex and it differs among societies, and that typically we know the context of words. Sometimes they have to be explained, obviously. So when we use sex and gender interchangeably in our language, English, we typically know the context, but we gender things. I mean, we give our vehicles gendered attributes, right? Like, what does that have to do with sex? Like, your cars are typically female. Sometimes we have a hot rod and we call them by a female name. We call our countries, our nations, fatherland and motherland. Why do we give these gendered attributes to our nations? And to me, when you're just correlating gender with sex, you kind of lose the richness of your language and also your culture. And there's other reasons I can get into, but like to me, it's a language thing, and that the sex should be biological. And what you were describing with the chromosomes, like, yeah, obviously people understood each other's sexes, looking at their biology and looking at their genitals when a baby was born, that was their sex. But in their culture, there's very sophisticated and nuanced throughout history of like,
The fuck?
okay, now he's back on mine.
Wait, we good? We good, guys? Sorry, I don't know what happened.
Yeah, I can
lost you
see
both.
you dropped out for a minute.
Okay, no, we're
Yeah.
back.
Now
we're
I
back.
see your video.
We're back.
Okay.
Sorry, Wayne McPremer asked what happened. No, we're back. All good. Sorry. Skeet, I will
Okay.
ask you, just to be clear, do you want to define in clear terms then what you think gender is?
Just in a general sense, gender describes what's masculine and feminine in societies. And in that sense, it is correlated with sex, obviously, but it's a different thing, and that we should differentiate between the two. And to me, when you put them together as if gender just means sex, then you just lose a lot of things. And then you run into troubles, and I can get into the troubles with the way we look at society and men and women in society if you make them the same thing. So basically, it just means masculine and feminine, but there are some in different cultures. There's kind of like, I don't know, third genders, or if I hate to use the word spectrum because it's kind of it's used by the left a lot, and but in a sense, it is kind of a spectrum because there are some things. I mean, there's obviously things that aren't gendered as masculine and feminine, and then there's some things that take on dualistic attributes of masculine and feminine, and there's also like deities. In different cultures, they have different deities that have kind of like third genders or non-gendered, or like they take on both masculine and feminine forms. And I wouldn't call those third gendered. To me, gender is just basically masculine and feminine, and we should treat it as such.
So
And
how
we
many
can
genders
develop
do you
kind of-
believe that there are? Just the two?
I think that's the wrong way to frame the word gender, that there's like a set amount. It's just like a category of description. I mean, if I was to put two, it's masculine and feminine, and there's this like dichotomy of masculine and feminine, but there's this range of like in between or something like that. And that your gender, to me, gender isn't something that you have. It's your sex is your what I am a male. I'm not a gender. I have gendered attributes about me, and I can take on different gendered attributes. That doesn't change my sex.
Mason, do you
To
want to
say,
respond?
okay,
I mean, of course, there's everyone will have different levels of gendered aspects, but I believe that's the same with sex as well. I mean, you have XY or XX chromosomes, which clearly defines your sex, but every different person will have different levels of testosterone or different levels of estrogen. But that doesn't mean that they're not a man or not a woman. And there can be feminine men, feminine women, or masculine men, masculine women. They're still men or women. Still struggling to understand a differentiation between the word sex and gender.
yeah, and to me, this is where the problem comes in, because I agree with you in terms of like biologically, according to your sex, you could take on, a man could take on female or feminine gendered attributes, but they'd still be a male according to their sex. But according to society or their culture, you lose. If a man takes on female gendered attributes, from a gendered point of view, they lose their status as a man in society. And so if you're
not completely,
and
no
so-
one would think that because a man is more feminine that he's not a man at all. I don't think he would lose his status as a man.
Are you sure about that?
I'm pretty
Have
sure.
you been to
it's,
Thailand? I don't know.
No, I haven't been to Thailand.
Well, so this is like one point I could make about the gender thing, according how it's a social construct, if we want to use that term. And this is maybe a point of contention, is the term social construct. So gender to me is a social construct, and it should be, and there's nothing wrong with that. And actually, we should embrace it as such. Obviously, sex isn't a social construct, but gender can be, and that's a good thing. And that we should embrace that, and we develop richness in our society that from social constructs. And that, so I brought up the lady boys in Thailand. That's what I was referring to. And I've been to Thailand a couple times, and within their culture, they have this term lady boy. They have their own name for it. I think it's like Katui or something. I had to look it up. Within their culture and society, there's lady boys, and lady boys are their own gender, and they're obviously males born with male genitalia, but they take on female attributes, and you'll see them if you go there. I was just there a few months ago, last year, and you notice I was kind of blown away by, like, you kind of see them walking around, and you can point them out. They're obviously not women, and I wouldn't consider them women. And if you listen to videos where people interview them, For the most part, they'll be like, if you ask them, "Are you a woman?" They'll say, "No, I'm a lady boy." And to them, so within their culture, they have this kind of third gender called lady boy, or katui, I guess they call it, but I've never heard anyone say that. I just hear lady boy. And so to them, they accept that these people are not, they don't consider themselves women, but they aren't, to me, they aren't men either. They've kind of abdicated their role as men in society, and they become this third gender. And to me, that's a more, I don't want to say, I don't know if it's correct way, but I can understand that point of view of like, you're not really a man in our society anymore because you've decided you don't want to be a man. You're this
I
third
mean,
gender.
they're 100% a man to me.
So a man who wears lipstick and high heels and see, this is where the problem comes in. That this is why we have gendered roles. That a man in a different cultures have different meanings of what it means to be a man in society, and that some of those are like the type of clothing you wear or like how you act. You have masculine things that you do, and so if to me, someone who wears high heels and wears a mini skirt and puts on lipstick, they're not acting in a masculine way. And, you can play dress up, and of course, you're still a male. You should be treated biologically as a male, and the state sees you as a male. And obviously, for medical reasons, you're still a male. But you're not a man anymore, especially if you take that on as your identity. But you're also not a woman. This is where I would disagree with like gender ideology, is that you don't become a woman by just wearing high heels and mini skirt or whatever you want to say. So this is the point of contention I would have with like conservatives about it, that you're losing what it means to be a man by saying that just wearing high heels and mini skirts and whatever females are supposed to do in our society or gender roles, you're not a man anymore. And these people choose not to be men, and vice versa. You could say this about women.
Mason?
How would you?
Sorry, you just cut out for your last sentence there, Skeet.
Oh, he just threw it back to you. He said, how would you respond?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily losing what it means to be a man or a woman. I'm not saying that you can't express yourself or you can't behave in a certain way. That's not my argument at all. So to say that believing that sex and gender are interchangeable in the same definition, I'm not at all suggesting that men have to follow XYZ criteria to be a man, and if you don't do that, then you've lost what it means to be a man. So I find it interesting as well that you touched on the gender being a social construct. But you said earlier in the live stream that it's at least somewhat related to sex. So not really sure how it can be a social construct and related to sex, which isn't a social construct. It's fact. It's confirmable via DNA and chromosomes. So how can it be on one hand a social construct and related to sex on the other?
So obviously, when we conduct ourselves in the world, we have to defer to like the natural world whenever we construct things, so society itself is a social construct, right? Language is a social construct. Just about anything you think of is a social, like not anything apart from the natural world is a social construct. And we engineer things in in humans have to engineer things, and often we engineer things. We're bound by the restrictions of the natural world. And so when we engineer music or art or even physical objects we use, we need to think of humans in mind, and we need to correlate what we're building according to biology, because we have these biological, we're biological entities. So this concept we call gender, what it means to be masculine or feminine, is obviously correlated with something natural, just like anything else we construct in society. Our societies are built around the fact that we're biological creatures, and so we have to, how do we do urban planning? We have to think about the biology of the human. We don't just kind of make up things willy nilly. So to me, the fact that it's a social construct doesn't mean that it's just kind of made out of thin air. We obviously have to defer to something. But it is deferring to sex, as masculine and feminine are obviously related to sex, but that doesn't mean we don't, think of, why are different colors associated with male and female? Like, why are different colors masculine and feminine? Like, why is pink female or feminine and blue is the masculine color? What dictates that? Does biology dictate that, or is that just some sort of something we kind of figured out as humans? And then you could go on with this, like, why you go in a clothing store and there's a male or it's actually men and women's. So like, why do men's clothing have certain looks, and why are female clothing sometimes flowery and pink, and men are brown or whatever? Men like to wear black, and we don't wear flowers typically. Like things like that, very subtle things. That's what makes it a social construct, and it differs within societies. Some societies have some cultures throughout history and even now have different ideas of what it means to be masculine, what it means to be feminine, and they're informed by biology, obviously, because everything we have to do as humans is informed by biology. But we kind of develop sophisticated ideas around biology, and we kind of, I don't want to say we make up things, but in a sense we do. We decide what we get to decide, and that's the beauty of it, is like we decide as a people what is masculine and feminine, or what is beautiful and ugly. You can't really. Do we know what is? Does nature tell us what's beautiful and ugly?
So Mason, I'll let you respond, and then we'll move on the discussion a little bit. You respond, Mason.
I'm actually not sure we're going to be able to come to an agreement regarding the difference between sex and gender. But I would like to know what situations in society would we use. I'm just going to assume for a second that they are different, even though I don't believe they are. What are some examples in society that we would use the classification of gender rather than sex? I mean, I think for bathrooms, we're going to base it on sex. Sports should be based on sex. Hospitals and medical treatment should be based on sex. What's an example where you would base classification on gender rather than sex?
Okay, yeah. So I agree with you in there. Yeah, there's medical reasons sex is important, and I would actually say, and we can talk about this, the sports should be correlated, or should be correlated with sex, or whatever we should develop sports around. To me, that's just a cultural thing of gender. Is so clothing. Okay, people's identities, clothing you wear, or the way you speak, or all types of
So how many
aesthetic things.
How many different sections of clothing should we have if it's not based on sex and based on gender, and you I know you did say that you don't want to use this term, but you still did say it, that gender's a spectrum. So then how many different
Yeah.
clothing sections do we have in a shop? I mean,
Oh, I
just
don't
can't
really
think of
care. I mean,
any
to me,
feasible situation in where, if gender's a spectrum, that we would use that for classification.
no, I don't really care if there's a men and women's, like, that's why it's correlated with sex, is there's a men and women's clothing section, and I'm okay with, like, that's where we would agree. But it's more about, like, what dictates men's and women's clothing, and obviously biology, the way the clothes fit. There's differences between male and female bodies, but there's also differences within each group. So it's more like aesthetically what is masculine and feminine clothing, and that differs in society. I don't really, to me, it's not like it's not up to me to choose how many genders there are, or like what dictates, the name of the gender. And this is where I would differ if we had a third person on here, someone who's into gender ideology. It's not up to the individual. You don't choose your gender as an individual. Like, society chooses the gender in the way society determines what's masculine and feminine. And we do this collectively, that society determines what's ugly and beautiful, and all kinds of myriad of aesthetic values, that these are determined collectively. And so it's not really up to me, like my own personal views on like whatever certain genders is sort of irrelevant to me.
Okay, gentlemen.
I'm okay with the.
So, well, I think I'm not sure we're going to reach an agreement on this particular issue here, but Skeet, I would be curious to know, do you think that gender is something that, like, because you talked about how ladyboys is very common in Thailand and it's almost like a third gender, but do you think that gender should be something where anyone can be whatever gender that they want to be and use whatever pronouns that they want to use, or should it be a little more regulated?
Yeah, I don't. This is probably where Mason and I would agree. To me, that's dictated by culture and society, and that the pronoun thing is a bit. I'm not really into it, and people don't pick their pronouns in the way they don't pick their gender if they have a gender. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what to say about that. I don't particularly like it.
Do you think that people can identify as any gender that they want to identify as?
I mean, they can, but it's up to society society tells you whether you're a man or a woman, or your culture does, and you don't choose it as an individual. In the same sense that, to me, I view gender, if you're going to use gender as an identity, it's kind of like a job description. Like, you don't just choose. I can't choose to be a doctor. I have to perform the roles of a doctor, and society dictates what a doctor is. It's not up to me what a doctor is. There's certain things you need to perform to be a doctor, and so, but you can you can be a doctor as an identity, right? Your occupation is your identity in a way, and that's how I view gender in some sense, is that but you have to perform the role of being a doctor for society to tell you that you're a doctor, right? There's qualifications. It's a bit crude of an analogy, but I think it sort of works. And I would also say too, is like, I grew up as a skateboarder, and I would listen to punk rock music. And so we have all these identities of like, oh, I'm a skateboarder, I'm an athlete, or I'm a punk rocker, or I'm a heavy metal guy, or whatever. I view gender like that, like one of those identities. And you can sort of take that on as your identity, is like, oh, I'm a skateboarder. But you have to perform. Society has to tell you whether you're one of those things. You can't just decide I'm going to be an athlete. You have to actually you have to do the motions, right? So gender is, if we're going to use it as an identity, it has to be performative like that, and you don't just choose as an individual. You have to perform the identity, and society and culture dictate that.
Okay.
If
Okay.
that makes sense.
Mason, I've got a separate question for you where I wonder if you gentlemen may disagree on this, which is, do you think that men should be able to transition and become women, and that women should be able to become men?
It's a very good question. Short answer is no. I don't think so. You can certainly be a man, and if you feel like you're a more of a feminine man, that's more than okay. I'm not going to tell you that you can't wear a dress or you can't behave in a more feminine way. But to try and convince society that you're actually a woman is just utterly outrageous. There's no way you can transition from a man to a woman just by dressing a certain way or telling yourself and the rest of society that that's what you are.
Skate.
Yeah, I basically agree with Mason on this point, is that you just, and this is also, yeah, the contention with gender ideology on the left, is it's not, you don't decide for yourself. I'm obviously, I mean, I'm not the most masculine man, but I grew up as a boy and a man or a male. Just me choosing it doesn't make me a woman. And this is why I think that having kind of alternate genders is important. So we have these terms that even leftists use, or gender ideology people, the left use these things like trans woman and trans man, right? So to me, this is important, that we have these separate identities, because they use these terms. You're a trans woman is a woman, let's say. So a trans woman is a male, born a male, and decides to become a woman. But they still use the term trans woman. And to me, they're not a woman. They're a trans woman. They don't become a woman. And that we can differentiate between these people. And that if you want to make trans woman a gender in itself, to me, under the way I conceptualize these ideas, the word trans woman can be a separate gender category, because they're not a woman, but they've also abdicated their role as a man in society by chopping their penis off, or even just wearing women's clothes, or just simply deciding, I don't want to be a man anymore. You've given up your role in society as a man, and so we're going to have this other term for you. But you're also not a woman, at least according to sex. You can take on the roles, feminine roles, but you're a trans woman, or whatever word we want to make up for it. I don't know.
So,
I'm okay with that.
So you're arguing that these people are kind of a gender all on their own, and they're no longer a man or a woman. What bathrooms do you think they should use, and sports do you think they should play in that case?
Okay. The sports thing is complicated. Like, I would say, yeah, women's sports. And this is where the executive order, if you look at the name of it, it's called Defending Women. And I think that's good. That women's sports should be defended, and that biological women should, and this, I'm sure Mason would agree with this, biological women should be defended against men coming into their sports realm. And yeah, trans women shouldn't be playing women's sports. And the same with bathrooms. The other way around is a bit different. That trans women who become men, and maybe this is where Mason and I would differ, is that men don't really need to be defended against women, at least historically. Men particularly protect women and children, and that we base society's rules and that's where the bathrooms come in. Is to me, the separated bathrooms are to protect women against men, particularly because men are mostly the predators, and so men have to police other men. And to me, anybody can use the men's bathroom, even though men have their own bathroom. Anybody could, I'm okay with anybody coming in the men's bathroom. It's the women, biological women should have females or, females. Yeah,
Mason?
that's for the women.
I mean, this gets back to my point about, we can just, you and I here debate whether sex and gender are different, but this is where my argument comes into play, that the ramifications of treating them as differently in society cause problems. Because, I mean, to be fair, you didn't actually say this, but a lot of people would argue that, bathrooms should be based on what you're calling gender, and as opposed to sex, and the ramifications are what you've just outlined. Same with the sports, and it's actually, you've got a really interesting take on this, because the left view and people that are in support of your argument that sex and gender are different have a lot of differing reasons for that to you. So it's actually, I'm surprised that we do somewhat agree on some issues. But like I would say that, you did say that the sex and gender are related, whereas a lot of people on the left and a lot of the people that believe sex and gender are different, their typical argument would be that, sex is biological and gender is, how you feel, it's your identity, and they're completely unrelated. And my question to the people that have those views would be, if they're completely unrelated and gender has nothing to do with any physical attributes or anything tangible, why do transgender people, why do they need gender affirming care to, feel more like the gender that they're trying to feel like, if they're completely unrelated to the physical side, why does a transgender person need, hormone therapy or puberty blockers or surgery? That to me just shows a clear link between gender and the physical attributes. And we've already determined that sex is determined physically via chromosomes and other things. So to me, that just completely shows that the two words are interchangeable and, have the same definition.
Well, before you respond to that, Skeet, I did want to bring up that subject of transitioning as well, because you both agree that if a person decides to go from and undergo gender or sex transition from male to female or female to male, they're not technically the other sex. You both agree on that. But do you 100%. Then think that it's appropriate for kids to be able to transition? That's a question for you to start with, Skeet.
Yeah, I would just say probably a hard no. Yeah, I think Mason, this is where we would agree that the problem with the kids, yeah, that's a problem. And maybe that's the good thing about whatever Trump's doing. I think that protects the kids. And I think that came up in the subject in some of your recent videos. I haven't watched them totally, but yes. I think that is in Australia. Didn't you guys have a recent thing about that?
Yeah, we did. Yes, I was just at a protest on the weekend where one of our states has banned puberty blockers for minors, and I believe it must be allowed in all of the other states, actually, which is still going on. And the trans argument is that it's, they're perfectly reversible and safe, and it's basic healthcare. It's a human right. So yeah, what do you think about that, Skeet?
Yeah, I think that kids should be out of this. Yeah, I think that's good that the state steps in with the blocking kids from this because their parents. And I've actually recently, it's an issue here in America. And like I said, I think we were talking earlier before the call, like I used to live, I lived in San Francisco and California. very liberal areas. And I hear more and more about kids. Yeah, like kids. I mean, I hear even from family members here in America, like actually Trump supporting family members, that there's kids like grandkids or something in my related to me. Like all these kids are now like either non-binary or they want to be like a different gender. And I, especially living in California here in America, man, I hear more and more. It's like 50% of the kids seem to be like non-binary or transgender, and actually some of them do get over it. Like it's just some sort of phase they go through.
If they don't have the
that happen
therapy, then
before.
they get over it.
Yeah, it's just some sort of identity they take on at school amongst their friends, and maybe we can talk about that. Like, why is that? But yeah, I think protecting the kids against any sort of medical procedures or yeah, that's terrible to me.
So,
I think Mason would agree.
100%.
and Skeet,
I mean, there's.
yeah,
Sorry,
you go, you go, Mason. You finish your point.
I mean, yeah, 100%. And this is what I get back to about the ramifications of trying to separate gender and sex. This is the type of problem that it leads to because, you know, if we both agree that sex is undeniable, but the kids that are claiming they're transgender, claiming they're the opposite gender to what they're born with, then they start taking this gender affirming care, and a lot of them argue that it's to save their lives, but there's been clear concrete studies that suicide rates post surgery, post hormones actually go up by an extreme rate, and a lot of the damage is unreversible. So that's another example of how treating sex and gender as the same is dangerous for society. Sorry, treating them differently is dangerous for society.
Skeet?
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of disagree. I don't see how it's dangerous. I'd have to think about that.
I mean,
according to with the children.
To expand, it's dangerous because people that believe they're a different gender start taking this therapy, and it's dangerous for them in that it results in suicide. And, you know, a lot of the people that believe they're a different gender, if they weren't to take the gender affirming care, a lot of them, I think it's about 80 or 90%, grow up to go through that phase, and a lot of them turn out to be homosexuals. So instead of a boy, you know, feeling like he's the wrong gender at, say, age 12 and having surgery or hormone therapy to appear to be more like another gender, and then growing up and realizing they've made a mistake, what happens is that they grow up, they become an adult, they don't feel that way anymore, and a lot of the time they're just homosexuals. So that's how it's dangerous for society to treat the sex and the gender differently, because if we're saying that gender is how you identify, it's how you feel, and that you're able to change it, these people are tricked into thinking that, and that's the end result. Whereas if we were, as a society, treated sex and gender the same, we know for a fact you can't change your sex, they're the same, therefore you can't change your gender. We're not going to have the gender affirming care, and a lot of these kids are going to grow up and go through that phase and return to believing that they're the gender that they were truly born in.
Skeet?
Okay. Yeah, this is where I see where you're coming from. But this is kind of where there's like, to me, there's an inverse to that. And this is why the language is important, and this is why kind of the left seems to own this. They understand the language and they separate the two. And you'll notice, I don't know if you guys are old enough, but I remember when people use the term transsexual. I don't particularly remember transgender being a term when I was younger, but I do remember the word transsexual. And to me, that's what they're doing with this transgender, the gender affirming ideology, is that they're trying to change their sex. And when you're getting into medical procedures, you're now trying to meddle with your biology. And to me, calling it transgender or gender affirming care or whatever, it's that's why I find that term troubling. And that if you, I haven't really thought about this too much, but it's to me, you're trying to be transsexual, which to me, I don't think is possible. It's possible in the future that like maybe we can manipulate our chromosomes and change our sex. But that's a kind of a different subject. But I think that's what they're trying to do is
to jump in there if you're to answer Mason's question about do you think that, you know, because you are against you want to keep this stuff away from kids, you know, as adults you can do what you want to decide what gender you want to be, and that's your stance as an adult. But Mason's point was that a lot of this sex and gender is different stuff. Mason was arguing is potentially harmful for the kids because then they're starting to think about this more and it's confusing them. And Mason, that was, I guess, Mason's question to you is, do you think that it's harmful to associate sex and gender as different things for the kids?
I would, no, I don't. I mean, personally, no, because I have to defend this view that gender is separate. And to me, it's just obviously separate the way culture and society talk about gender, that we have this separate subject. And like I kind of said before, that gender isn't particularly an identity that you take up in this, like you just don't decide what gender you are, and that kids can learn that your gender isn't you in the same way that your sex is you, right? And to me, this is a better way to look at it, is that you're born with an identity, a biological identity, right? You're human. We know what human is. We're all humans. And your sex. And then your age kind of dictates whether you're a boy or a man or a girl or a woman. And that kind of fluctuates, I guess, who becomes a man or a woman. But if you differentiate between the two, and that children can learn that like gender is not your identity that you just decide. Your sex is, see, this is why kids are confused, is because they're being told that gender is your identity. And if you separate that from sex and have it a different category in the way we talk about it, then kids won't learn that they can't just decide what gender. They can take on different gendered attributes, but if their gender is different than their sex, then trying to change your sex isn't, like, you can't change your gender by changing your sex. Or I don't know, maybe I haven't really thought this over too much.
I actually understand what you're trying to say here.
Yeah.
But I think a far better way of phrasing it is, you know, that we all have different personalities, and you know, if you feel like you're more feminine or more masculine, that's your personality. It's not your gender that's shifting; it's your personality that's shifting. And a lot of my argument is that when we're trying to separate the two, it causes damage to society. And you know, my example for that is the gender affirming care and the suicide that it causes in the kids. Mm-hmm. I do actually understand your point, and but I think a far better way of phrasing it is that, you know, we're all different people. We have different personalities, not that our gender is changing.
Yeah. To me, I think it's the inverse. You could argue that by conflating the two, and that children get confused, they think that their gender and their sex are the same thing. Then they think that, like, well, I can change my gender by trying to change my sex, and like I can go through all these biological medical procedures, and therefore I'll become a different gender. I think if they have a more sophisticated view of it, or at least the adults need to, this is problematic with the kids. Like we just don't need to be telling them that they can change their sex or their gender, that your sex is your sex, and
So do you
you're
think that,
born with that.
that
In the same way that you're a human. Go ahead.
so do you think that we should teach kids? What do you think we should teach kids along these lines? Because obviously, you know, kids don't have as great a comprehension on these things as adults do. So should we be teaching the kids that there are there are differences between sex and gender, and that they are two different things, and try to explain the differences, or do you think it's a bit hard for them to be able to grasp the differences?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't know. It's not up to me to decide. I don't really have strong opinions about like what we should be teaching kids. Well, I do in some sense. Like, I think it is wrong. I've heard recently from. I was talking to a teacher, and she was actually telling me how the stuff they teach kids, and it's much different than what I learned when I was in school. I mean, I was in school in the 80s and the 90s, so I was learning just general sex ed. Um, so personally, yeah, the stuff I hear that they're teaching kids seems very problematic. And I don't find a problem with the way I view gender and sex. I think you can actually take my views or like what I'm trying to describe here, and it doesn't cause any problems with me and like what you teach kids. So um, that kids should just learn biology, and that they can have their view of their identity based on you're a human and you're this sex, and gender is a separate thing, and like you don't have to meddle with your biology to perform different gender roles, or if you want to be more feminine.
So
See,
why do
this is
so many
maybe where
people?
the problem is.
Sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah, go for
You
it.
just said that we don't have to meddle with sex. You know, if you feel like you're a different gender. Why do so
Mhm.
many transgenders do that then?
Well, you'd have to ask them, and like maybe this is why we need a third person. But I guess, and I've read comments, and if you listen to people talk about this, they do, they will. I think some trans activists or transgender people themselves they will sometimes say like, yeah, your biology, it's not totally psychological. There is a biological component to your gender. That's what they would say. And that they're trying to make their biology match what they view as their gender. And they'll just agree with that, as far as I can tell.
I mean,
And
to
to
me,
me,
that
that sort of makes
completely
sense.
debunks their argument. You know, they're trying to align their biology with a gender that they believe they are, but that inherently just shows that they're the same thing or closely linked.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. This is why I would say that gender shouldn't be thought of as like you don't take on gender as an identity, that gender is this kind of different subject beyond. I mean, there's identity components to it, but it's not like who you are. It's this performative role you take on, and that it's separate from biology. It's correlated with biology, obviously, but it's separate. It's not the same thing. And that, to me, this makes more sense to me. And
Okay,
this would
so
actually, I don't.
sorry
Yeah,
to
go ahead.
cut you off there, Skeet, but Mason, I've got a question for you, which is,
Go ahead.
so Skeet earlier was talking about ladyboys in Thailand, right? And I guess an argument from the left commonly is, how does it affect you if they want to identify as, you know, let's call it ladyboy, a third gender, as Skeet was sort of alluding to earlier. If, let's say they still want to use their biological sexes, bathrooms, and play in their sports, but in their day-to-day life they want to identify as a third gender. What's your problem with that? How does that affect you?
I mean, to be honest, I don't live in Thailand. I've never been to Thailand, so the ladyboys have zero effect on my life whatsoever. I've said it before, if a man wants to dress as a woman, he has every right to do so. I don't think they should be banned from wearing a dress. But that doesn't make them a man. It doesn't make them a woman just because they dress up as one.
Yeah, Skeet, would you agree with that?
But are they still a man? That's what I'm trying to say. Is like it's not up to them to decide. It's up to you to decide collectively as men or as a society
I
to
mean,
determine.
By that premise, does that mean that if society was to, if a select society was to, majority say that someone who identifies as trans woman, to say they're still a man? So would you say that society is correct? Because you're saying gender's determined by society, not the individual. I mean, a lot of people on the left would think that would be outrageous to say, that if society was calling a trans woman a man, they would think that's disgusting.
Yeah, I agree with that in a way, but I would also find it disgusting, or I don't know if disgusting is the right word, but I would find it problematic that you're still calling this person a man when they're trying to be a woman, and that now you have this society, you're now calling a person who's performatively trying to be a woman, you're just identifying them as a man in your society, and then now you've lost what it means to be a man, because now this person is like, they could even chop off their genitals, and to you have now within your culture, you've decided this person who's performing, trying to be as feminine as they can, even by going to the extreme as destroying their genitals, but their chromosomes are still male, but somehow they're still a man within your society and culture. And to me, that's a problem you were going to run into. Now you've lost the meaning of what it means to be a man from a cultural perspective.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying there. I wouldn't say that it's lost the meaning of a man. I'd just say they're a more feminine man. I wouldn't say that they're not a man at all.
Yeah, sure. I'd say I know where you're coming from.
Okay, boys. Well, we've got a comment coming through.
Okay.
We've got a few comments, but YVMG Fishin said, "Real gay people are actually embarrassed by all these gender bender idiots running around and the damage and division they have caused." What do you think, Skeet? Because I feel like Mason might agree with that. What do you think? Do you think there's gay people out there who think this movement's gone too far?
Oh, most definitely, yeah. There's probably lots, but there's probably lots who also align with it, because I mean, I lived in San Francisco, and there's a lot of gay people there, and it's not like I'd go around asking people's opinions, but this is somewhat of it's kind of trendy there to be like queer or whatever, it's like a trend.
Yeah, we've got
similar,
and it's kind of the same in our city,
yeah,
in Melbourne. Yeah,
it's not just San Francisco, it's in the West.
Yeah,
or maybe it's global. But I would agree with that generally, but I think, but you can even find gay people who are opposed to like LGBTQ. Like, there's some gay people who they don't want to be mainstream. They liked it being edgy when gay was kind of edgy and you were different and it was kind of underground. That's the same with like being punk or whatever edgy thing. Now like punk is like non-existent because it's become mainstream. I think there's gay people like that who like, no, I want to be kind of like different and edgy. I don't want to be corporate. Corporations have taken over this stuff. And so, yeah, of course that's a thing. I think that comment is accurate.
But I guess my question for you is then, do you think that your stance around gender and sex being two different things plays into some of the things that you're worried about?
Plays into it?
Because this guy's I guess this guy's comment was about how he described them as gender bender idiots, but basically people saying that gender is a societal construct and it is whatever you want to be, is causing damage and division. Um, what do you think?
Yeah. I'm trying to, like, to me, it's just historically and culturally that gender is a complex issue that's a different subject than sex and biology. And you can like look through cultures and see how how different cultures have talked about gender versus sex, because you look at different religions and their deities have different genders. So this isn't something like new, like it's taken a new form, obviously, with all this gender ideology. And so you have to, I see the position that Mason is taking as like reactionary rather than kind of being, it's not very sophisticated, or it's just simply being reactionary and opposing it rather than kind of thinking about the complexity of the issue, the actual real complexity of the issue historically and even naturally, that like you're just kind of being reactionary. And so you're just going to take this like opposite stance, and that humans, we don't talk and think about this way. It's not a very realistic view. It's just reactionary.
Mason.
And I'm not totally opposed to it. It's not like I find it immorally wrong or something. It just seems problematic to me.
I mean, I don't think it's reactionary at all. I think of the issues that separating the two has caused, which I've outlined, and the dangers of doing so. What would you say is a benefit of separating the two?
Kind of like I said, like the benefit is that you can now prioritize between, like, as culture, you can prioritize things of between good and bad. And like when you separate gender and sex, you can prioritize between biological sex we're going to use as our identity as the state or as a society, that we obviously identify as humans, and we separate ourselves from the animal realm, and we make ourselves important by differentiating ourselves against animals as we take on this biological identity as humans. And then sex also plays into that because it's biological, and that you can prioritize then gender roles and this thing we call gender, whatever masculine and feminine, we can now prioritize that of like, how important is that within our society? And that's not up for me, that's up for us collectively to decide. It's an aesthetic value rather than like a scientific one of like, what are women supposed to do? What are men supposed to do? And how important is this identity? Like I said before, your gender identity, if we want to use gender as an identity or a role we take on, we can now prioritize that as like, well, that's actually not important in how we're viewed as a society. That our importance is our sex, and our biological identity is primary to like how the state views us and how, like, medical things or whatever. And then we can prioritize the gender identity as just some sort of like, oh, I'm an athlete, or I'm whatever my occupation, or whatever, I'm a punk rocker. I always use that one.
I mean, isn't that just your personality? I mean, to say my gender is an athlete is just ridiculous to me. It's just your personality.
But we all take on different identities in society and culture, and we prioritize them of like.
Why are we wanting to call that my gender? That's just my personality.
Well, like I said before, like I kind of find it problematic, like my gender, like I don't really think of it as my identity, my gender, like I'm just a male. And I'm in the same sense of like my identity, of course I identify as a human, but it's not something I choose. it's like I'm born this, and that's how I relate to the world, is by I'm a human, I'm not an animal, I'm not a dog or something. That gender, if like to me, it's not really an identity. It's a description of masculine and feminine things we do and roles we take on, and that like man and woman, what it means to be a man differentiates between societies, and we see this in different cultures because we have what are those what is it when you go through a like different cultures have, like when you become a boy from a man, differentiates between culture. What's the name for it?
Initiations.
Yeah, initiations or something like that. Like, you know, Mexican or Hispanic people have quinceañeras, right? Like you become an adult, and that different that there we in our society it's like 18. Like who chose 18? There's nothing really. There's a correlation with biology there, but it's kind of very vague and gray. It's not like a black and white thing. And to me, gender is kind of the same thing. It's kind of fluid, or it's just a description. It's not some sort of category thing that we have these boxes we put in the same way that sex is. It's like this binary.
Mason,
Does that make sense?
I'll let you respond and we'll wrap it up fairly shortly, boys. But, Mace?
To be honest, I'm not really sure how to respond to that. Just completely in disagreeing with that part in particular of Skeet's argument. I mean, you're saying that you know, gender is not about a box or not about that, but and you've also said that it's, you know, determined by society. So what are they determining if they're not putting individuals in a box?
Like I said, yeah, what was the word? The rites of passage. Maybe that's what I was thinking of. So different cultures historically have different rites of passage, like when a boy becomes a man. And to me, that's like a gender type thing, is like, even though a like boy, when you, there's no biological thing that determines an exact date or time when you become a boy, when you transition from a boy to a man. And so you have like a rites of passage in different cultures. And gender to me is kind of similar. It falls within that category of like rites of passage, or what determines a boy. Because maybe in some cultures, a boy never becomes a man because he doesn't fulfill the obligations of what it becomes. He never fulfills the rites of passage. Same thing with a woman. And to me,
Well, we've lost Skeet there, but hopefully he comes back. But if not, we'll wrap it up shortly.
Hey, we lost you there.
Oh, yep.
those societies that like it's up to the tribe or the group to collectively determine who's a man, who fulfills the rites of passage as a man or a woman. And I mean, it's a very complicated thing, but like society's complicated, but it's participatory. We all collectively participate in this thing we call culture and society, and we get to determine. And to me, the left knows this, they understand this, and they use language. That's why they use the term gender. And even us here speaking, we're using this term gender interchangeably, and in that the executive order, to me, that shows me that we're now using this term gender in a different way than we did 50 years ago. I'm old enough to remember that the term gender really wasn't correlated with sex in the same way. Like, we're using the word gender now very much interchangeably. And that shows that the left kind of understands language a lot more than the right, and the importance of it. And just conflating the two just isn't sophisticated enough to get to the point of all this, to me.
So in that case, because we started this discussion talking about Trump's executive order, and you said you didn't have a huge problem with it, apart from the fact that you don't know why governments had to step in. But based on what you've just said, you would have a problem with it because you don't think there are just two genders.
Um, yeah, to me, I think that's the wrong framing. That like now we're conflating the two and saying I don't have a problem with there just being two. To me, it's just masculine and feminine, or if you want to call it man and woman. But it it's up to society to do that, and that to me, what they're talking about in this executive order is sex, and it's not gender. And gender is a very complicated subject that it covers a broad range of like human activities and things. And so by using this term gender, you're kind of buying in. To me, I see that as sort of like you've sort of lost the battle of words in a way.
So are you saying
Yeah,
that
it's just about sex.
are you saying that you think basically gender is masculine and feminine, sex is male and female, and gender is so masculine is the equivalent of male and feminine is the equivalent of female, and that's as far as we need to go. Is that all
Yes.
you're saying?
That's not as far as we need to go. Like we can, like I said, like Thailand, that they have this third gender, and even in our society, like we have these people, transgender people, that they're not, to me, in some sense, in a gendered sense, they're neither man or woman. They've kind of like, and that's why we have separate words for them. They're trans women and trans men, and like we call both sides call them trans women or trans men. Like we all use the same words, and if those are gender categories, I don't know, like they don't fall between. They're just kind of weird masculine and they're neither masculine or feminine. I was going to bring up something else. I completely slipped my mind.
Mason, would you like to respond?
The one thing.
You go.
Yes,
Skate.
you can respond. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Another thing I wanted to bring up too is like, Charlie Kirk, the
Yeah.
political pundit here, and he talks about this a lot, and I agree with him on certain things. But he kind of got caught in this kind of word trap, where there's a video where the kid asks him, "Well, what gender is God?" And well, then he's like, "Well, Jesus was a male or whatever." But this is how you separate. This is why you need to separate gender from sex. He kind of had to admit that God, to him, was non-binary, because he was conflating the two, the gender and the sex, and that since God doesn't have a biological body, unless you think Jesus is God, like so he admitted Jesus, but like God as an entity, since God doesn't have biology, he admitted that God was non-binary, and he kind of didn't know how to articulate this, because his conception, he didn't know how to separate gender from sex. And if you just separate gender from sex, you can just say, yeah, my God is gendered as male. I mean, he sort of admitted that in the language, but he said that God is non-binary. And I mean, I don't particularly prescribe to, I'm not a Christian like him. I mean, I grew up Christian, but to me, God is male. The Christian God is male, is a man, or is male, is gendered as male. He's not biologically a male, because like God doesn't have a biological body. He doesn't have chromosomes, but God is a male in a gendered sense. And that to me, that shows that you can separate the two, and your God doesn't have to be non-binary. Your God is gendered as a man, even though he doesn't have he doesn't have a sex.
Mason.
That's an interesting point, but I'm not sure we should be using attributes of of God to compare that to humans. I don't really think any this is across the board, not just with gender and sex. I don't think any attributes of gods or higher powers we should be really using them as a basis for arguments regarding humans.
I mean, to me, that's not the basis of it, but that shows that you, it's a, that shows how gender is separated from sex. That you can, your God, your divine, your divinities, your deities have gendered attributes, even though they don't have physical bodies. And this is cross-culturally, this is historical, that various deities have different gendered aspects, even though they're not biological bodies. And this is why we need to, we shouldn't conflate the two terms, and we should think of gender as separate.
Well, it is an interesting point that you bring up, because obviously in a lot of the European languages, certain words have genders on them, and they are different words based on if they're masculine or feminine, right? French is the prime example of that. So I can see your point in that regard, and I can also see Mason's point where he thinks it's dangerous to conflate the two. Boys, we'll wrap it up. I'll give you both one final word, or basically to summarize your position before we say goodbye to everyone.
I'll go first if that's all right.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Go ahead.
I understand where Skeet's coming from, and I think it's from a place of empathy and wanting to express yourself. But I think we should just call it your personality. It's not your gender, and the dangers of treating the two as separate are that it confuses kids. They then think that they can change their gender, and then they start taking this gender affirming care, which is dangerous. Whereas if we treat the two as exactly the same, we know for a fact that you can't change your sex, you can't change your biology. And if we treat the two as exactly the same, then no one's going to think that you can change your gender as well. And the gender affirming care won't be there. It's not going to ruin kids' lives. It's not going to result in an increase in suicides. And also just can't see any benefits of treating the two the same. I'm all for expressing yourself, but I believe that's your personality. It's not your gender.
Skeet, to summarise your position in 1 minute before we wrap it up.
Okay, I appreciate the Mason's opinion, and I think he is coming from a sense of empathy as well. We just have different opinions about how to express our empathy and our view on the subject, and I don't know how to sum it up. I kind of said everything, but I think differentiating between the two adds, like, we can talk more about these things more sophisticatedly. We don't need, it enriches our life, it enriches our culture, and I think this is where the right should think about things more sophisticatedly, about language, and about, think of things aesthetically rather than about scientifically. That you can direct culture aesthetically, and that gender is an aesthetic thing rather than a scientific thing. And humans, this is what makes us human, is humans are aesthetic creatures. We've separated ourselves from the animals. Like, animals' whole existence are determined by biology, and humans are not. We determine what's good and bad, or we determine what's ugly and beautiful. And so gender kind of falls into that category of, like, what do we can determine what is what we want out of society, and we're not determined strictly by biology. So it just adds richness and sophistication by separating the two. And to me, it's like a more intelligent way of looking at society and humans.
Okay, gentlemen. Well, thank you both so much for having a civilized discussion. It's been fascinating. I think you've both got
Thanks for having us.
Interesting
Nice to talk to
points.
you, Skeet.
Yeah, thanks both of you guys. Yeah, you too. Good luck, Mason and Connor, with everything, both your endeavors. I think you're guys. I'm not criticizing you guys morally or Mason. I think that's like you keep doing what you're doing, and good luck with everything.
Thanks, Skeet.
Good luck with
Same to you,
Australia
brother.
too. Yeah.
Thank you guys, and
Yeah,
I would love to have
yeah.
you both on, especially if we get someone both back on. If we get someone on the left, anyone in chat, if you do ever want to jump on one of these debates, shoot me a DM at ConnorKenX on Instagram. More than happy to set it up. Whatever position you want to take on any sort of issue, I'll try to find someone to take the opposite position. But thank you everyone for watching, and until next time, take care.
Okay.
See ya.
Thank you.
See ya.